Welcome to the program. I'm Jeff Schechtman. I think that it's fair to say, and we can stipulate, that experience and competence matters in most things. And while you may not like the decisions, we wouldn't want a neophyte to run Goldman Sachs or General Motors or Boeing or Apple. And yet in many cases, that's exactly what we've done with the entirety of the executive branch of the U.S. government. And no, I don't mean who we've elected president to set tone or make decisions or make broad policy, but rather the White House Chief of Staff, whose job it has been to focus the president, to execute policy, and to engage in Washington diplomacy and deal with both the minutia of who uses the White House tennis courts and at the same time have a 30,000-foot view of how America is governed. In the modern era, there have been 17 chiefs of staff in the White House, and all of them participated in a new book by my guest, esteemed journalist and documentary filmmaker Chris Whipple. Chris has been a multiple award-winning producer at CBS's 60 Minutes and ABC's Prime Time. He was the executive producer and writer of Showtime's Spy Master, and it is my pleasure to welcome Chris Whipple here to talk about his new book, The Gatekeepers: How the White House Chiefs of Staff Define Every Presidency. Chris, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. My pleasure.
It's great to have you here. This book grew out of a documentary that you had done. Tell us a little bit about that first.
Yeah, it was a phone call out of the blue in 2011 from a filmmaker named Jules Naudet, and he and his brother Gideon had done 9/11 for CBS. They wanted to know if I would partner with them on a film about all the living White House chiefs, and so we did. And that aired on the Discovery Channel back in 2013, but it struck me that it just barely scratched the surface of this unbelievable untold story of, as you say, 17 living White House chiefs of staff who really have been the difference between success and disaster for every presidency.
You know, it's sort of axiomatic that we say, particularly every 4 years, that there's really no preparation for the job of president. Is there any kind of preparation for the job of White House Chief of Staff?
Yeah, I think, it's hard, first of all, it's hard to overstate the critical importance of the job. I mean, every president learns sometimes the hard way that you cannot govern effectively without empowering a White House chief who is first among equals in the White House. That may not sound familiar at the moment. We're not seeing that. But the duties are... there are so many of them, but one of the critical things is that you need somebody who is grounded, who is comfortable in his own skin, who has been around the block. James A. Baker III under Ronald Reagan was the gold standard in that regard. Leon Panetta was right up there with him. These were guys who were confident enough to walk into the Oval Office, close the door, and tell the president what he didn't want to hear.
You talk about the role of Chief of Staff in the modern era, really beginning with Nixon and Haldeman. What changed at that point?
That's right. It really begins with, you could go back to Eisenhower and his chief, Sherman Adams, but I really trace the modern empowered White House chief as we now know it to H.R. Haldeman under Richard Nixon. He was the ultimate gatekeeper, which, of course, is the guy who controls access to the Oval Office. It's a critical function. It gives the president time and space to think. But the chief is so much more than that. He's also the guy who controls the information flow to the president. He's the so-called honest broker who makes sure that information is teed up on every side of an issue. He's the guy who takes the bullets for the president when there's incoming fire. He's the closest confidant. And he's the guy who executes the president's agenda. At the end of the day, he's the guy who figures out whether you've got the votes on Capitol Hill or not.
One of the things that's made it difficult as you look at the history of these chiefs of staff is always that transition from campaigning to governing, and so many of these chiefs have made that transition, some well, some not so well.
Yeah, no question about it. And, often you have outsider presidents coming in with, young campaign staffers who want to change the world, who want to just, really stick a finger in the eye of the establishment. But think about Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan for a moment. Jimmy Carter was arguably the most intelligent president of the 20th century. He was trained as a nuclear engineer. Ronald Reagan, not so much, right? But Reagan intuited something that Carter never understood, and that is an outsider president needs a consummate insider to get things done. And Reagan found that guy in James A. Baker III. Carter it took him 2.5 years to realize that he needed to appoint a White House chief at all. And at the end, he picked the wrong guy, Ham Jordan, who was his political strategist, but, the worst possible choice, totally disorganized, incapable of running the White House. And, the results speak for themselves.
It's interesting that even those presidents that come to office as seeming insiders, once they become president, there's almost an outsider patina that takes over that still requires them to need that insider chief of staff.
Look, it's great if you want to be a disruptor. If that's your goal, you can come in and you can try to govern without a chief who knows what he's doing. Governing is tough. It's nothing like running a family real estate firm in Manhattan. You can't have 5 or 6 or 7 guys coming and going from the Oval with equal access without empowering somebody as chief and having a chain of command. Jerry Ford tried that, the so-called accidental president after Watergate. Ford called it the spokes of the wheel with Ford at the center. It was a disaster. Within a month, he realized he couldn't govern that way. He couldn't prioritize. And we're seeing something very similar in this White House right now, except Trump hasn't learned the lesson that Ford did, I think.
Why was it such a disaster for Ford, who really came to the office, as you say, accidentally, but really was an insider, had spent years and years in Washington and in Congress?
Well, what he learned was that you can't run the White House the way you ran your congressional office. He'd been minority leader, but you can't run the White House that way. You have to have a chain of command. You have to have somebody who's the gatekeeper and somebody who is in charge of executing the agenda. It's fine to have, passionate debate among various factions within the White House, but then at the end of the day, the chief has to execute and everybody needs to fall in line. That's what, Ford, after a month, realized he was in way over his head. He was, as somebody put it, drinking by fire hose, learning by fire hose, and he reached out to guess who? Donald Rumsfeld, who was a tough, disciplined guy, and he turned the Ford White House around.
And, of course, with Donald Rumsfeld came Dick Cheney.
Yeah, and it's, the book is not just lessons in governing in the White House, which I hope it is, but it's also this flesh and blood portrait of, as I say, 17 living White House chiefs. They're fantastic characters ranging from Haldeman to Rumsfeld to Cheney to Rahm Emanuel. Think of Dick Cheney, who was, believe it or not, as a 34-year-old chief of staff to Gerald Ford, he was the life of the party. He was the most popular guy in Washington. He was self-effacing, great sense of humor, loved to play pranks. Ever since chiefs have been looking at each other and saying, what happened to that guy? And it's a great story tracing the change in Cheney, the various theories about him. And, of course, they come full circle when Cheney and Rumsfeld, who had been Cheney's mentor, have so much power in George W. Bush's White House.
What are the commonalities as you talk to all of these people, as you look at all of this? What are the common traits that you can say all of the successful chiefs of staff had?
Well, the really successful guys, I think, and so far, of course, they've all been guys, that will change at some point. But I would say that the really successful ones are guys who really were comfortable in their own skin. Think of Jim Baker, who was as smooth as silk Texas lawyer who had nothing to prove. He was 50 years old. He was the kind of guy who could walk into the office and tell Ronald Reagan unpleasant truths. Reagan wanted to go up to Capitol Hill on basically day one and try to reform Social Security. Baker said, that's the third rail of American politics, Mr. President. You touch it, you'll be electrocuted. You need to rethink this. Reagan did and wound up going with tax cuts. And the result, the rest is history. It's hard to imagine somebody like Baker or Panetta, letting a president go down this disastrous road of repeal and replace Obamacare, where even if, first of all, they don't have the votes in the Senate. Second, even if they succeed, it's going to come back to bite them with so many people losing coverage. So that's how important a chief can be.
Talk a little bit about the relationship between chiefs of staff and family members, first ladies or other family members of the president.
It's something a chief always has to deal with. You have to pay attention. As Bill Daley told me, and he had at least one run-in with Michelle Obama. This was Obama's second chief of staff, of course. If you want to survive as chief of staff, you better make sure the first lady is never blindsided. And I think that, again, in the Reagan White House, you had Nancy Reagan, who was famously called the personnel director. You had Michael Deaver, who was practically family. He was a deputy chief and in charge of course, choreographing Reagan's appearances. Baker was smart enough to befriend those two. And with Nancy as an ally and Deaver in his corner, when the hard-right ideologues came after Baker, whom they called the pragmatist, Baker prevailed.
One of the things that's so interesting is you talk a lot about the importance, obviously, of the relationship that evolves between the chief of staff and the president. And in some of these cases, there have been chiefs of staff that have been there for a long time, multiple years. And then you have situations like Obama where he went through 5 chiefs of staff in 8 years.
Well, he went through 4. I mean, he had an acting chief in Pete Rouse, but Reagan went through 4 as well and was successful. Clinton went through 4. Chiefs come and go, and it's an unbelievably thankless 24/7 relentless job that a lot of chiefs burn out from. I mean, Cheney blames the job for triggering his first heart attack years later. Bill Daley came down with shingles when he left. It's not for the faint of heart, and every chief should go in prepared to resign within a couple of years. And I think Andy Card would be the first to tell you that he stayed too long. He was there 5 years and 3 months, and I don't think he was as sharp, and I think he'd admit it at the end.
Talk about Rahm Emanuel.
Rahm, there's some great stories in the book about Rahm, going all the way back to when he was senior advisor to Clinton in the Clinton White House, of course. He was famously the guy who always took the hill, as Leon Panetta put it. Bill Clinton tried to fire Rahm 4 or 5 times, and Panetta and Bowles, Erskine Bowles, who succeeded Leon Panetta's chief, wouldn't do it. They wouldn't hear of it. And Clinton would say, why not? And they would say, because, Mr. President, every time you come and give us Mission Impossible, we give it to Rahm, and he comes back 2 days later, and it's done. There are dead bodies behind him, but it's done. That's what he did, I think, also as Obama's chief of staff. He was a guy who really knew the Hill, and he got a lot of stuff passed. They needed $1 trillion stimulus or close to it, and Rahm knew exactly how to get those votes.
Talk about the chiefs of staff that have been the most ineffective, and is there any pattern to their ineffectiveness?
Yeah, there are patterns, and fascinating because, we've all heard of Rumsfeld's rules. Something I like to call Jim Baker's rules. One of them is that people who have been principals before, CEOs, governors, people who are accustomed to ordering people around, tend to be a really bad fit. As Baker puts it, they think the most important word in the title is chief, not staff. And Donald Regan, who succeeded Jim Baker, was a great example. He was a former Merrill Lynch chairman. He was imperious. He was haughty. He was arrogant. He liked to have himself announced when he walked into a room. He became a laughingstock. And he finally met an untimely end when he hung up on Nancy Reagan. after an argument, Baker said, "That's not just a firing offense. That may be a hanging offense." And sure enough, he was gone in a week.
How has the role changed in this era of 24/7 communications? Even going back to the Nixon era, people weren't accessible every second on their cell phone or whatever. That has put more pressure on the job, I would assume.
Yeah, it's made the job even more relentless, even more thankless, even more 24/7. And I think it makes the role of the chief of staff all the more important because, even in the Clinton era back in the 90s, Erskine Bowles would tell you that it was the chief's job to make sure that when Bob Reich was saying something in Kansas City, the labor secretary, that Bob Rubin was on the same page saying something on Wall Street. You have to make sure, as chief of staff, you're in charge of communicating the president's agenda. And, with 24/7 news cycles, that's even more critical. And look at this White House. The current White House is kind of like a kid's soccer game where everybody's running toward the ball, and nobody knows where they're supposed to be on the field. That's what a chief of staff is supposed to prevent.
It's interesting that you say that because I really was thinking about the fact that almost everything you say about successful White Houses, successful chiefs of staff, successful relationships between presidents and chiefs of staff is antithetical to what we're seeing today.
Yeah, what we're seeing right now is, without a doubt, the most dysfunctional White House in modern history. In a way, it should bother Trump's supporters as much as anyone else. I mean, if you oppose everything Donald Trump stands for, this is the White House staff system for you. It's just misfiring on every cylinder and breaking every rule that that White House chiefs the presidents have learned the hard way. You can be a disruptor all you want, but if you want to govern, you have to pay attention to what your predecessors have learned.
Talk a little bit about the evolution of Clinton and his various chiefs of staff along the way.
It's fascinating because Bill Clinton came into office. He spent almost all of his time picking his cabinet and almost none of his time choosing a White House staff, which is more important. And at the very last minute, he chose an old friend who went all the way back to kindergarten, Mac McLarty, Thomas F. McLarty, who was known as Mac the Nice. He was the most popular guy in town. Everybody loves Mac, but he wasn't empowered by Clinton. He wasn't given the authority to discipline that guy. And the result was a year and a half in, Clinton was really dead in the water. His agenda was really, his major stuff was going nowhere. There was almost an intervention staged by Hillary Clinton and Al Gore, and they flew Leon Panetta, the OMB director, to Camp David to meet with Clinton. And Leon said, I found myself in a cabin with Al Gore, Tipper Gore, Bill Clinton, Hillary Clinton. I knew it wasn't going to be a fair fight. He didn't want the job, but he took it, and he became one of the most successful chiefs in modern history.
Of all of the four chiefs that Clinton had, was he the most successful?
I would say he was. I think he turned the Clinton White House around. But I got to say, Erskine Bowles and Podesta were very effective too. And Erskine Bowles, who succeeded Panetta, was a very, very sharp businessman. His mantra was organization, structure, focus. He kept Clinton focused. He ran a very tight ship. And so did Podesta, especially during the Monica Lewinsky scandal. He called himself the Secretary of Blank. He had to deal with all that stuff. But so I think those guys were all effective.
It's interesting that after Rahm Emanuel, that the other White House chiefs of staff under Obama were pretty mild-mannered or pretty, low-profile guys. Yeah,
they were, think of no drama Obama. Those guys were all pretty low key. Bill Daley was an awkward fit. I think he clashed with the younger Obama staffers and also with ironically, with the Chicago Mafia. He was from Chicago. That was Valerie Jarrett and David Axelrod. But I think that McDonough was very effective in the end as the chief of staff for Obama, especially with governing by executive order, which was really pretty much the only choice they had in that atmosphere. And, they had the Iran deal and the opening to Cuba and other stuff to show for it in a very, very tough climate.
Mm-hmm. To what extent is Jim Baker still considered the gold standard in terms of all that we're talking about?
I think that everybody would tell you that. All of his successors would tell you. I know Dennis McDonough used to call him frequently for advice as Obama's chief. The very first phone call every new chief makes is to Baker, and Baker always tells him the same thing. He says, "Congratulations, you got the worst blanking job in government." And then he goes on to give them constructive advice. But yeah, as I say, I think that he's considered the gold standard because he really could do it all. As my old friend Susan Zirinsky, the former White House producer for CBS, said, Baker had the secret sauce.
And after Baker, who would you put next in that pantheon?
For reasons that I've told you, I'd put Leon Panetta right up there. Panetta was described to me by Bob Reich, the labor secretary, said, Leon had an iron fist inside a velvet glove. You don't have to be the president's son of a bitch. You can do it with finesse as long as you've got an iron fist when you need it. And Leon did. I think that Podesta and Erskine Bowles were very effective. I think Don Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney were very effective. Jack Watson, Jimmy Carter's final chief of staff, should have been his chief of staff on day one. It might have been a different story. Those guys were all top-notch, I think.
Talk a little bit about chiefs of staff that have been brought in to recover from disasters created by others. I mean, Ken Duberstein was one. I mean, there are several. Yeah.
Well, you mentioned Duberstein. Right after Don Regan resigned, after slamming the phone down on Nancy Reagan, Ronald Reagan was in serious trouble. Iran-Contra had really exploded, and there was talk of impeachment. And Howard Baker Jr. came in as chief of staff, the former, of course, who became famous on the Senate Watergate Committee. And he brought in Ken Duberstein as his deputy, and the two of them made a secret pact. They said they were going to sit Ronald Reagan down, and if they thought he was lying about Iran-Contra, they would resign. They sat him down. They did not think he was lying, and they managed to persuade him to do a mea culpa, that famous speech that Reagan gave where he said, my heart tells me that I wasn't involved in trading for hostages, but the facts show otherwise. It really turned that presidency around.
Future chiefs of staff that may serve future presidents will read this book, and why would they want the job at that point?
Good question. It's the worst blanking job in Washington, but it's also the second most powerful job in government. Jim Baker describes it that way. Dick Cheney says, and Cheney ought to know, that the chief of staff has more power than, if you want to put it in those terms, than the vice president. He doesn't go on to say, except when Cheney was vice president. But it's an extremely important position. I think all of these guys would do it again in a heartbeat. And these are guys who care about the country and care about the White House.
And how many have approached it from a policy perspective, thinking about it in terms of what can be accomplished policy-wise, as opposed to an administrative and sort of corporate perspective?
Well, I think the guys who approached the job with an ideological axe to grind were the guys who did not succeed. I think the ones who were successful were the ones who realized every day that it was the president, it's his presidency, not yours. You're there to help him execute his agenda. And I think the good ones understood that. The ones who were trying to push an ideology didn't. I mean, Dick Cheney, when he was Jerry Ford's White House chief, was ideologically somewhere to the right of Genghis Khan, as somebody put it. But he didn't push. He didn't push his agenda. He was there to help Jerry Ford execute on Ford's beliefs. So that's the key to the job.
And finally, particularly watching what's going on now, what does the experience of all of these other White Houses tell you about at what point you can recover and at what point it's too late?
Well, it's interesting because, as I say, every president learns the hard way sometimes that you have to empower a White House chief as first among equals. So far Trump is oblivious to history. He hasn't learned that lesson. It took Bill Clinton a year and a half to figure out that he needed to empower a White House chief, which he did in the form of Leon Panetta, and it turned his presidency around. It took Jimmy Carter 2.5 years to realize that he needed a chief. It was too late. So we'll see. We'll see what happens. I mean, this may be a president who just doesn't, at the end of the day, want a grown-up in the room. We'll find out.
Chris Whipple, his book is The Gatekeepers, How the White House Chiefs of Staff Defined Every Presidency. Chris, I thank you so much for spending time with us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.